Dynamic IP, that's it. Okay, dynamic IP is the common name of DHCP. Okay, so in that case, it is the computers don't know who they are when they wake up. Okay, so we'll just pretend that I'm a computer. Okay, so we'll write a little story of what happens with these computers. Okay. So we have DHCP, or more commonly known as dynamic IP. Okay. So step 1, computer A wakes up, not knowing its IP address. So this is not good, okay? Because if I don't know my IP address, I'm not qualified to talk to other computers through TCP/IP. Because if I want to talk through TCP/IP, I need to have an IP address too. It's just like with your phone, okay? You pick up a phone, that's my phone. If your phone is not activated, it does not have a phone number. And as a result, you cannot call somebody else because the caller ID cannot show up on that somebody else's phone and say it is coming from number blah, blah, blah. So until I have a phone number, I cannot call other people. Okay? So that's the first step. So what happens is, in this case, computer A will ask using DHCP, which stands for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, to ask a server. Okay? So 2A is computer A presents its MAC address. Okay. So I'm computer A. I wake up and I say, uh-oh, I don't know my IP address, and I want to get onto the internet right away. But since I don't have an IP address, I cannot do that. So the first thing I need to do is to call out to what we call a DHCP server. Okay? So I will say, is there a DHCP server here somewhere? I need an IP address. But since I just woke up, do I know the IP address or the MAC address of the DHCP server? I know nothing. Okay? So the first message I'm sending out is actually a broadcast message. It is not intended to a particular computer. It is a broadcast message intended for all the other computers to listen to, and I'm basically screaming, I don't have a name, I don't have a number, give me a number. And here's my ID. Okay? This is my MAC address. So a DHCP server, standing on somewhere within the local area network, will basically intercept that broadcast message and say, oh, I'm the DHCP server, and you need an IP address. Okay, let me see if I can give you one. Okay. Now, what do you think the DHCP server has to do to give an IP address to computer A in this case? I'll just randomly pick a number. No, that probably won't work. Yep.
Check the MAC address and then the assigned number for it.
Right. The first thing it has to do is to know what is the network address of this local area network. Okay. Because if you just randomly assign a number, the computers cannot talk to each other. So you have to make sure that if let's say you're using 192.168.1.0 for the network, then the computer can only be assigned numbers that start with 192.168.1. The only thing that can change is the last portion. So the DHCP server first has to understand what is the network address of this local area network. Then it has to look up a table and say, okay, which addresses are already assigned? Okay, let's see. 192.168.1.3 is already assigned, 1.4 is assigned, 1.5 is assigned. I cannot use a range, which is reserved, and so on and so forth. So after checking all these requirements and restrictions, it will come back and say, well, I can give you, how about 192.168.1.15? Okay? So the DHCP server, which is a router box, one of the residential gateway that you have, or another computer, will basically come back to computer A and say, okay, this is my offer. You can have 192.168.1.15. Do you want it? I can't wait to get onto the internet, so I'll say, yes, 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 I will get it. Okay? So at that time, the DHCP server will basically put a little mark next to that address and say, okay, one computer has now used up this address. and the MAC address is da 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 da. Okay? So that's how dynamic IP works. You basically wake up knowing nothing about your own IP address. You broadcast a message and say, well, DHCP server, wherever you are, I need an IP address. Now, it's not quite as simple as that, but it is, if I want to kind of simplify the story, it is just like that. Okay? How does that relate to dynamic IP when you connect to the internet through your ISP? How does that relate to, what is the difference between a static IP and a dynamic IP when you subscribe to an ISP? Is there a difference? A static IP does not change.
Static IPs don't change for dynamics. You pick from a pool from what they have.
Exactly. Okay. So if let's say you subscribe to AT&T. Okay. AT&T wants to charge you a lot of money for a static IP. Okay. But if you can settle for dynamic IP, hey, it's just regular price. Okay. But what is the advantage? Why do people want to pay more for a static IP as opposed to a dynamic IP, which is no extra cost? Yep.
Hard to find a specific computer if they're always bouncing around from IP addresses.
That is true. Okay, so if I want to be able to connect from this computer back to my home computer, and my home computer is using dynamic IP, which means my ISP can change my address on a regular basis, it gets a little bit more involved to find it. I can find it, but it is more involved. Go ahead.
You can also use it for a web service like Apache if you don't want it to keep bouncing around.
Right. Yep. So a static IP has a lot of advantages if you want to be able to locate that computer from other computers. A dynamic IP is fine if you're only going out from that IP address to the outside world. Okay? Now, the next question is, how often do you think your ISP will change your dynamic IP? Yep.
Doesn't it depend on your router? How much it reserves the IP, how long it reserves the IP?
It cannot actually, your router can try. Okay, when you configure a router or residential gateway or firewall, if you will, you can configure it to try to hold on to an IP address, which means your router is constantly using some traffic to keep the connection open, so that it will not just say I'm idle, I'm releasing my IP address. But there's no guarantee, okay? Because when the DHCP server says tag you are 192.168.116, a part of that offer is to say, but you only get to keep this IP address for this many seconds. Okay? When I said I agree to it, I'm also agreeing to the lease period. Now, when the lease period expires, okay, I am obligated to ask the DHCP server again, and this time I would say, I used to have this address here, my lease is up. I would prefer to keep it, but I have to tell you that my lease has expired. Do I have a new IP address, or can I keep the old one? At that point, the DHCP server can actually decide and say, no, tag, we cannot, you cannot keep using that IP address. Your new IP address is 192.168.124, whatever. Okay, so I can try to keep my IP address, but there's no guarantee that I can keep using that one, even if I try to keep, even if I keep all the internet traffic to try to keep, the same IP address. Okay, but that is actually good from certain perspectives. When you have a static IP, then people can find your computer easily, which is good if you want to get back to your own computer or your friends want to access your computer for something. But it is bad from the hacking perspective, because now the hackers can keep attacking the same computer day after day, month after month, year after year, because it has the same IP address, it has the same address. On the other hand, if you have dynamic IP and your computer is not exactly secure, the hacker can only try to attack your computer within the lease period. Because once the lease is over and your DHCP server or your ISP decides, okay, you now have a new IP address, guess what? The hacker cannot find your computer anymore, because the same IP address is going to go to another computer. So from the security perspective, dynamic IP may not be a bad thing, okay? Because it limits the time frame that a hacker has to attack a specific computer. Okay?
Why do they do this? Why do they like try to hack the computers and try to like destroy them?
No. They don't want to destroy computers. They want to turn your computer into a bot, into a zombie. Zombies. No, zombies
Do they
are.
get some money or credits for that, or
No.
is it just a blind thing, or-
No, they are just enlisting your computer to be one of their soldiers.
Wow.
Yes. So these hackers make money from, there are a variety of ways of making money, but by far the most effective way for these hackers to make money is to blackmail banks and other, online services. Okay? Because, individuals, we can only have so much money, they can hack into my tax return and whatnot, and there's only so much they can do with it. But when you're talking about banks, what these hackers would do is they will, send an anonymous, email to a bank and say, deposit this much money in my Swiss account, or else we will launch an attack on your server. Okay? And most of the time, the banks would actually comply and deposit the money. Very rarely, they would actually try to fight the hackers. So let's just say that a so-and-so bank is saying, I'm not going to pay you anything. I'm going to report it to the authority and whatnot. So what happens is, the hacker can trigger their botnet to attack, these servers, owned by this particular bank, which also means, basically, hundreds of thousands of computers that are zombies will be instructed to say, just try to make as many requests as you can to that particular bank computer. Okay? It may not crash, but this is what we call a denial of service attack, or DOS attack. So basically, legitimate customers of that bank also cannot access the bank through your computer. Now, when you're talking about customers like us, and you cannot do your online payment or whatever, it's probably not a big deal. The bank is not going to go bankrupt or have a lot of loss because of that. But do you think Wells Fargo is Wells Fargo because of individuals like us? No, they have commercial customers. They have commercial partners. Now, what kind of money do you think those guys are transferring? Are they transferring like $40, hundreds of bucks, or even thousands of bucks? No. Millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions. Okay? Now think of the interest that you're going to lose on a per second basis when you're talking about $1 billion. It is significant, isn't it? Okay? So that's why the banks cannot afford to have the system down or out of service. And that's why a lot of times they would actually pay off the hackers to avoid these problems. Of course, that is not solving the problem, because these hackers will just come back and say, let's see who's on my sucker list, right?
Didn't they like hack Twitter or something?
Sorry?
Didn't